Welcome everyone to today's GlomCon. I'm Dia Waggis back in Houston. So today we are very honored to have Dr. Aliza Thompson speak with us. Dr. Thompson received her medical degree from Johns Hopkins Medical School, completed her internal medicine and nephrology training at Columbia. She also holds a Master of Science in Biostatistics and Patient-Oriented Research from Columbia University School of Public Health. Since 2007, she has worked at the FDA and currently serves as a deputy director in the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And her most recent accolade is she was this year's recipient of the National Kidney Foundation's Public Service Award, an award recognizing the work of a kidney health professional who has demonstrated exceptional dedication to public service and who has significantly contributed to public policies or government programs that improve outcomes from kidney patients. After her talk today, we will have a discussion with Dr. Thompson. Our moderator today is Dr. Brad Rovin, a professor of nephrology and the division director at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. He also serves as the medical director of the Clinical Research Management Institute at the Ohio State University. And our panelists joining us today are Dr. Debbie Gipson, a professor of pediatrics in the division of nephrology at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Jula Inrig is the global head of the Renal Center of Excellence within the Cardiovascular, Renal and Metabolic and Therapeutic Science Strategy Unit at IQVIA. And Dr. Inrig is an associate professor of medicine at UC Irvine. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Thompson.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to try this again. You can hear me, right, Dia?
Yes.
Yes, great. So let me try this and you're going to tell me if it didn't work. Well, again, thanks so much, Dia, for all your work putting this together and for giving me this opportunity to participate with you all today. It is an incredibly exciting time for drug development, I think, for both common diseases as well as rare diseases. And so it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to talk with you now when so much is going on. Over the next 20, 25 minutes or so, I want to touch upon really 5 topics. One, first is just speak about, in general, drug development for rare diseases. From there, talk about endpoints and approval pathways in the US. Then move on to talk specifically about one approval pathway, the accelerated approval pathway, in considerations to verifying the benefit in the post-marketing setting. Move on to patient-focused drug development, obviously a critical issue, as well as another critical issue, enhancing the diversity of our clinical trials. So in many, many ways, drug development for rare diseases is incredibly challenging, right? We're dealing with very small populations of patients. But at the same time, we're seeing tremendous successes in this space. If you look back at 2020 and novel drug approvals in the US in 2020, at least or upwards of 50% of those were approved for the treatment of rare, or what we consider or term orphan diseases. So again, just a tremendous amount of success. So why is that? I think a lot of it stems from a law that was issued in 1983 in the US called the Orphan Drug Act. And essentially what that law did was it made it financially viable for companies to essentially develop therapies for rare diseases, because that was obviously a tremendous hindrance. I think another thing that's really facilitated the development of treatments for rare diseases in the US is that we also have a number of programs that are available to expedite the development of these therapies and also the review of these therapies. Because simply we have a number of programs for or pathways to do this for rare and or rather for serious and life-threatening diseases with unmet medical need. And one could argue that many of the rare diseases we see fall into this category. I'm not going to talk today about most of these programs, but I do want to spend some time talking about the accelerated approval pathway, because that's really the pathway a lot of these drugs or development programs in the rare kidney disease space plan to use to get their drugs approved by the FDA and available to the American public. So to take a step back, just to orient you, in the US, we have two pathways to approval of a therapy. One is what I'll call traditional approval, which is approval based on a clinical outcome or a clinically meaningful endpoint. And by that, I mean an endpoint that reflects how a patient feels, functions, or survives. We can also base that approval on a validated surrogate endpoint, which I can talk about more in a little bit. This other pathway we have is called accelerated approval. Again, this is a pathway that we use for serious or life-threatening diseases. And in this setting, approval is based on a surrogate endpoint that we consider reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. We can also use this pathway to approve therapies based on what we call an intermediate clinical endpoint, but really the area that I want to focus on today is this use of what I'm going to call a reasonably likely surrogate. I also want to make the point that in the US, at least, this is the only pathway we have that gives us the opportunity to resolve outstanding issues related to effectiveness. In other words, verify the benefit in the post-marketing setting. So let's take another step back and say, well, what do I mean even when I use the term surrogate endpoint? Often people use the term surrogate just to mean a substitute. But when we're talking about drug development, we're talking about the US FDA and how we approve therapies, we have a very specific meaning when we use the term surrogate endpoint. And what we mean by that is it's an endpoint that's used in clinical trials as a substitute for a direct measure of how a patient feels, functions, or survives. So a good example of this would be serum creatinine, right? Our patients don't come in saying, Doc, I feel like my serum creatinine is a little higher today. They don't, but yet we use serum creatinine-based endpoints because we think treatment effects on them predict the treatment effect on the outcome we are trying to prevent, which is progression to kidney failure. So again, a surrogate endpoint, it doesn't measure the clinical benefit of primary interest, but rather we're using it because we expect it to predict that clinical benefit or sometimes harm. And it essentially needs to be supported by data, and that data can be based on epidemiologic or therapeutic or pathophysiologic or other scientific evidence. And at least from a regulatory standpoint, we generally characterize surrogate endpoints by the level of clinical validation. So either it's a validated surrogate endpoint, again, that endpoint we can use as the basis for full approval, that's reasonably likely surrogate endpoint, which can be used for accelerated approval, assuming the other criteria for use of this pathway are met. And then we have something we call just a candidate surrogate endpoint. Maybe people are exploring it, but it's not really ready for prime time use. So let's focus and think about this within the context of glomerular disease trials and the endpoints we at FDA accept as a basis for approval. We certainly accept as a basis for full and traditional approval a clinically meaningful effect on the loss of renal function. And this doesn't mean that you have to double your serum creatinine, which is the surrogate endpoint that was historically used to approve therapies for common diseases like diabetic kidney disease. This can be showing that your therapy essentially slows the rate of decline, and your development program provides confidence that this effect in terms of slowing the rate of decline continues to accrue over time across the various stages of disease, so that we can conclude that that the effect that we see on creatinine in a trial, which may be small in absolute terms, that's going to translate into a clinically meaningful effect ultimately on progression to kidney failure. For a number of primary glomerular diseases, we've also been willing to accept a complete remission or near normalization of proteinuria in patients with marked proteinuria at baseline as a surrogate endpoint. We consider it validated and would accept it as a basis for full approval. We also very much I think it's quite reasonable to believe that some other improvement in proteinuria short of a complete remission is likely providing benefit to a patient, but there's a bit more uncertainty over how and the extent to which these improvements in proteinuria translate into benefit. And so that's where we really get into this reasonably likely surrogate in using sort of improvements in proteinuria that fall short of a complete remission. as a basis for accelerated approval. And then I want to hit on the other important endpoint that we're excited to see and increasingly, trying to, encouraging sponsors to consider in their programs, or endpoints that capture the important symptoms of, the disease and their impacts. And I'll speak more to this later, but I do want to emphasize that, obviously one of the most important endpoints or things we want to affect in the lives of the patients living with kidney diseases is ultimately their progression to kidney failure. But some of these diseases, as you know, can be quite symptomatic. And so obviously improving the symptoms so that we can improve the quality of a patient's life, that's also an important benefit that therapies can provide. So, again, an incredibly exciting time for drug development for kidney diseases and rare kidney diseases, for glomerular diseases. And at least, for those of you who've been following the space and the types of trials that are being done and the design of these trials, I think you'll probably realize that many of them are designed as accelerated approval development programs. These endpoints, again, that's showing treatment effects on proteinuria that fall short of a complete remission. There's a lot of basis to believe that we're doing a good thing, and that will translate into a benefit in terms of, slowing the rate of progression to kidney failure, reducing the risk. But there's still some uncertainty. And, one of the big issues that we have faced, and have had to, work with the community to try and address is really how to figure out how to design trials that can be completed, that are feasible to complete in the post-marketing setting to actually verify the benefit. So again, the context is the drug is approved based on an effect on proteinuria, short of a complete remission, some amount of reduction in proteinuria, and then the trial continues. And we're trying to resolve the question of whether it, in fact, the drug slows the rate of loss of renal function. So, two critical things about this confirmatory trial. One is, we want a trial that, if the drug does have an effect, it's adequately designed to detect it, so it's adequately powered, et cetera. We also, but as relates to this, we also need to be able to interpret, a trial that fails, and it gets back again to adequate power and other, considerations. If the trial is negative, I need to be able to reach the conclusion that it's negative because the drug doesn't work, not be left with a whole bunch of ambiguity, because obviously that doesn't help us as a community in terms of figuring out whether to keep a drug on the market and whether patients should continue to use the drug to treat their disease. So one aspect that we can address based on just more statistical considerations is whether we think the post-marketing trial is adequately sized to support the size of the effect seen on proteinuria in the study that led to initial approval, accelerated approval. And I think we addressed this at a prior session, and I'm not going to talk to our approach to do that from a statistical standpoint. But I do want to highlight other aspects of this that we struggle with. And that is that if you think about the time course for progression of many of these rare glomerular diseases, it can take decades, right? Or if not decades, a decade for patients who are at risk of progression or high risk to progress to kidney failure. And so often to even just to detect an effect on the loss of renal function, we're going to need patients to stay in their assigned treatment arms after approval for another maybe 2 years, right, to actually detect the effect on the loss of renal function. And it's important to note that even if we make sure the trial is fully enrolled at the time of accelerated approval, once a drug is on the market, patients could decide just to take the drug, open label, just to use it. And the people who've enrolled them in the trials may also decide that that's maybe, what they want to do for their patients, that they don't want to keep them in the trial. And of course, what that means is if patients don't remain in their assigned treatment arm, the trial may fail to verify the benefit, even if in fact the drug is effective, right? The other thing we worry a lot about is that if you have a trial that takes a long time to complete after a drug has entered the market, that you're going to end up with a lot of missing data potentially in patients who are either just lost to follow-up or withdraw their consent for follow-up. And so again, we're stuck in a setting where, we have a trial that was completed, but is largely uninterpretable, if it's negative. So what safeguards can we incorporate in the design of these trials and the design of these development programs to ensure that trials will complete in a timely manner following accelerated approval and provide, again, what we need, which is interpretable data? A huge issue. Another issue that, is somewhat unique to the design of our programs is that the trials that are being used to support accelerated approval in the rare kidney disease space, the trials that are currently being done, essentially we're using the same trial to support both accelerated approval and also verify the benefit. So again, the concept is you enroll patients in a trial, and after a certain number of patients get to maybe 9 months of treatment, you do a pre-planned analysis to see whether you actually affected proteinuria. And then based on that, the results of that analysis, and assuming you successfully showed that effect, you essentially take the data and some other available data and submit it to the regulatory agencies, at least in the US, to support your application and to support approval of the product under the accelerated approval program. And then the idea is that the trial continues with subjects, or rather participants in the trial, remaining in their blinded treatment assignment. They stay until its end, and then all the data are supposed to be analyzed as relates to the treatment effect on the outcome that we're trying to show a benefit on. So one key issue that we've been facing and really struggling with is how do you maintain the integrity of an ongoing trial, right? How operationally do you take this look at the data early on and submit it, right, the results for regulatory review, and still make sure that other people are blinded to treatment assignments, make sure that ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to be able to think that this trial was well done and that, again, that knowledge of study findings didn't influence, how the trial was somehow the outcome that you're seeing. The other issue we struggle with is how much and what type of information should be released to the public. Bear in mind, a lot of drug development companies need to share information with the public, right, about interim results and findings. And so obviously, we worry about what information should or shouldn't be released, bearing in mind that the release of certain information could really impact the retention of patients in the ongoing trial once the drug is approved. And again, ultimately, hinder our ability to actually resolve the critical question that we need to resolve, which is, is this therapy providing the benefit? So what have we said about this? I mean, one key issue that we've said is that we need to make sure participants in the trials really are part of this discussion and understand what the implications are of being in a trial that is designed as really, as part of a larger trial where the concept of, approval will be granted based on an interim look at the data. So we want to make sure, for example, that the informed consent explains using language that is understandable to a patient the purpose of the trial within the context of what I call here Subpart H approval, which is one of the accelerated approval programs. We also think it's critical that the trial participants understand the implications of initiating therapy with the marketed product, and really the importance of attending follow-up assessments as relates to really the public health issue here and the interpretability of the trial results and continued approval of the product in the U.S. Because, if they don't want to stay in the trial, this is really not the right trial for them. So again, we think it's really critical to engage in discussions with the participants in trials about these issues and make sure that the informed consent document actually makes all of this apparent up front so that patients can decide whether this is the right trial for them, and to better ensure also that, again, at the end of the day, we'll have relevant interpretable data. And with that, I'm going to shift to really another key topic, which is patient-focused drug development. I'm also going to pause and take a look at my watch, and I think we're doing okay for time. So I think it goes without saying that patients should really be at the center of the drug development process. But I think it's also fair to say that I think for a long time we lost track of that. But fortunately, I think both, at the FDA, I know my colleagues at other regulatory agencies outside the U.S., and really just the community as a whole, when we think about, the conduct of trials, is really trying to and understands the importance of placing patients really at the center of this process, bearing in mind that we are developing the therapies for them, not for us, obviously. In terms of some specific initiatives at the U.S., in the U.S. and in what I refer to as our patient-focused drug development initiative, it really has sort of two overarching goals. One is just the science around this. How do you do this in a systematic way, meaning collect in a systematic way and utilize in a systematic way robust and meaningful patient and caregiver input into the drug development process. Another aspect of this, though, is really listening and hearing from patients what matters to them. And then thinking through this and what we mean by patient-focused drug development, it includes issues like how can we do a better job of really designing our clinical trials to facilitate patient enrollment, to minimize the burden on patients of participating in clinical trials. It's also about understanding patient preferences, not just in terms of, what endpoints are meaningful to them or what, endpoints they want trials to look at, but also understanding ultimately the acceptability of trade-offs between the treatment benefit and risk, bearing in mind that all of our therapies have toxicities and some have more toxicities than others. And then finally, another critical piece of this is really relates to communicating information to patients and how we can do so in the best way to support their decision making, bearing in mind that this whole process, this whole enterprise is really about patients and providing them with drugs that are right for them. Fortunately, at the FDA, we've had an opportunity over the past few years to have a number of listening sessions, or not listening sessions, a number of patient-focused drug development meetings. These are meetings that are set up where we get to listen to patients about what matters to them in terms of their disease, what they want from therapies, and also really explore and get a better sense of, as we design clinical trials, how do we design trials that are right for patients with specific diseases? So here I'm just going to show you in the next few slides some of what we've heard from patients at some of these patient-focused drug development meetings. And I'm going to focus on slides from a meeting we had, or information from a meeting we had on IgA nephropathy. Just as further background, essentially how these meetings work is, international participation is encouraged, in terms of hearing from the international patient community. And after we have these, essentially day-long meetings, the groups that organize the meetings will put together what's called the Voice of the Patient report, because obviously we want to document what patients shared with us about the critical impacts of the disease on their lives, and what they shared with us about, the design of trials that would be acceptable to them. So this one is from, again, a patient-focused drug development meeting on IgA nephropathy. And one thing that came out of the meeting that I think we hadn't really realized before is that at least in a fair number of glomerular diseases, there's a lot of patients are having fatigue, and fatigue not that, is sort of, I think we often think of when patients advance to sort of the end stage of their kidney disease, there's a lot of fatigue. But what we were hearing is that even in patients with relatively preserved renal function, many of them were experiencing significant fatigue. And maybe for those of you who treat these patients, this is something you know already. But this was an important realization, and want to highlight that I think it's led to, incorporation in clinical trials, a number of trials of actually instruments that are intended to capture treatment effects on fatigue patients are feeling, because obviously, if we could have therapies that improve that as well, that would be great. Another thing, again, point that I want to make is we are using these as an opportunity to understand how we should be designing our clinical trials and what endpoints we should be looking at. And so this was a question to the patient community who was participating at the meeting on what sort of top 3 measurements do they really consider relevant to their disease and would want included in clinical trials. And, it's not surprising a number listed changes in renal function or delaying time to dialysis or transplant. A number emphasized heavily, the issue of proteinuria. I think the patient community very much well understands the relationship between proteinuria and outcomes in this disease. And then you also see patients listing outcomes such as their general quality of life. And there you see again fatigue cropping up. Another issue we've tried to understand with them relates to this accelerated approval pathway and, its acceptability to a patient. Again, this concept is you could be in a trial and, the drug is essentially approved and on the market, and would you stay in that trial bearing in mind that you could be in the placebo arm? And so at least, those surveyed, about 44%, as you can see on the side, said they were very likely to remain in the trial, even with the understanding that they could be getting a placebo, and another 30% said moderately likely, and some said, no, I just wouldn't enroll in this trial, or sort of gave a, I'm not quite sure, I'm somewhat likely. Another issue we asked was, okay, if you're game to participate in such a trial, how long would you be willing to stay in your assigned treatment arm? Again, bearing in mind you could be in placebo after the drug is approved and on the market. And as you can see, at least up to 1 year, a good fraction of patients were willing to stay in the trial. But if you're talking about trials that are going to take 2, 3, or longer time points to complete following approval, we are really need to be seriously concerned about patients, essentially dropping out of the trials and taking the therapies, just accessing them that are approved. So it is a big issue we need to think about as a community as we design these trials and what is actually feasible in terms of the length of the post-marketing phase. And then the other critical thing we've heard from the community, and hopefully Deb will speak more to this issue during the panel discussion, is that pediatric patients, adolescents, their caregivers, their parents, they want to have access to clinical trials. They want to have opportunities to participate in trials. They don't want to be excluded. Yes, there are therapies that they use, but these therapies have horrible side effects. And so they want, just like their counterparts, the adults, to have early access to clinical trials. They don't want to wait till after the drug is approved. They want to be given opportunities and now to participate. So again, another critical issue. And something we need to think about as we move forward with the design of these trials and really ensure that we do a better job of including pediatric patients in them. So I just want to highlight these reports are put out by the groups that host these meetings. I think that they provide tremendous insight into what matters to patients, and they give us a roadmap. And so we are really obligated to use it as we move forward in designing these programs. And then my last topic, and again, I'm just going to look at my watch, and again, it looks like we're okay for time, is another, what I believe is a critical one, which is enhancing the diversity of clinical trials. So if you talk to a regulator in any, I think, regulatory region, a critical issue for us is not just whether a trial, provides evidence of whether that the drug was safe and effective. We also want to understand whether the trial findings are actually applicable to the patients in our regulatory region, right? Because if they're not, because the standard of care is different, because of other differences, it's a challenge for us, obviously, then to approve the drug in our region. We need to believe that the findings from the trial actually apply to the patients living where we live. So in the U.S., one of the big issues we've struggled with is really making sure that our trials actually reflect the diversity of the American population. And though I think we've said on a number of occasions, our trials, and we've encouraged and required the collection of data describing race and ethnicity and age and and gender, at the same time, just even though we've encouraged that our trials and emphasized that trials need to have and be representative of the U.S. population, we haven't been as successful as we want to be. And so we, as an agency, recently issued some guidance with the hope that by discussing this issue further within the context of eligibility criteria for trials and enrollment practices, we could perhaps help move the field forward. I think this is just one of many guidances, or at least a number of guidance that will likely come out to address this issue of diversity, not just in terms of, I think, what we often think of as race, but also as relates to the elderly, patients with comorbidities. Bear in mind that often patients with advanced kidney disease have been excluded from trials, as well as, our pediatric population as well. How do we ensure that they're represented as well? And then just, I think that this is a wonderful resource. I think, I didn't give you the link, I failed, but we'll get that link for you. One aspect that I just want to emphasize maybe today is really this issue of how we can make our trial participation less burdensome for participants. Because I think that is really a critical issue, certainly a critical issue in the rare disease space. And certainly, as we think about our children or patients with that have serious illnesses where they're not feeling well, frankly. So, a key aspect of this, and again, a lot of this is not rocket science, but it is important to think through it when you're designing a trial, is can we reduce the frequency of study visits? Do we really need all these study visits, or can we reduce the frequency? Can we give more flexibility in the visit windows? Or can we use electronic communications or digital health technology tools so that patients don't actually have to come into the site? Can we send nurses to their home or phlebotomists to their home so that the kids or the patients can have their blood drawn that way and don't have to actually go into a clinic and deal with the getting there and the transportation issues and the parking issues? And then also to make sure that participants know during even the recruitment phase that there are financial reimbursements for expenses, right? Either costs incurred with participation in the trial, such as travel or lodging expenses. Make sure communities really understand this issue because, again, they may never have participated in the clinical trial before. I think other, key issues in terms of enhancing the diversity of clinical trials is really adopting also enrollment and retention practices that enhance inclusiveness. And again, what I'm sharing with you is not rocket science, but really just important things we need to consider as we design these trials. So, for example, working directly with communities on the design of these clinical trial protocols, having patients review them, right? And providing guidance as we design them in terms of what elements of the protocol may not be sensible because they could discourage participation. And perhaps also hear from these communities about how we could better optimize the design of these trials so that we could improve our recruitment. We also need to think about where we're conducting these trials in terms of the geographic locations or with a higher concentration of racial and ethnic minority groups or indigenous populations, as well as sort of the locations within neighborhoods where these populations receive their health care. And then finally, also just to highlight this concept of making recruitment events accessible, right? People work, parents work. We need to make these events accessible by holding them at times that people are available. And I guess speaking to you on a Sunday morning, or I guess it's afternoon or evening in various places, I think, with all of your busy schedules, you also understand the importance of things being accessible if we're actually going to participate in them. So just a closing comment. Yeah, and I think it has been a long road. I think that's fair to say, but I think it is also, we need to celebrate where we are right now. I think it is, again, an incredibly exciting time for drug development. We've got a number of trials going on, a number of pharma partners who are interested in investing in the space and developing therapies in this space. And I think it's important to pause and think about how we got here. And we got here, I think, because we came together as a community. I'm showing you many of the participants. That's heavily focused perhaps on the U.S., but it's not just been a U.S. community. It's been an international community that's really come together to advance the science and really advance the patient voice and really tackle a number of the challenges in this space. And so we've gotten here because we've worked together, I think, and we've gotten here because we've been willing to share data. So I think the more we do this, the more data we share, the faster we'll get to where we all need to go, which is to safe and effective therapies for people living with kidney diseases. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if I can exit out of all of this. Hopefully, Dia, you can stop my sharing.
Yes, thank you. And we'll turn it over to Brad.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson, for this excellent talk and really a lot of information here to unpack for the group. So I have some questions from the audience and also moderator prerogative. I'm going to start with the question first. So this experience of the accelerated approval followed by a part B of the trial, which is of course showing that the GFR, I think many of us on the Zoom today are actually participating for the first time in such trials. We're doing it right now, and I'll just use many of the IgA trials, for example, are designed that way. And so I have a question from myself, and also one from Dick Glassick, who's in the audience. And I'll say them both at once and then open it up for Aliza and then also the panel to discuss. So do we actually have any data? You've shown the data from the IgA patients that about half the patients would do the Part B, they'd stay in their group. If it lasted a year, that was acceptable, et cetera. Do we have any data of a trial in the kidney space where this has been done and what the success rate of retention of patients in the blind is over the course of the Part B of the trial, which is looking at the GFR? And then the second part, which comes from Dick, is once a drug is approved, is it ethical to keep the patient on the placebo? How do you want to answer that? Let's go with Aliza first.
Great. And so I think that this is, you're raising sort of critical issues. And I just want to sort of maybe in terms of the data issue, I think that this is uncharted territory for us. How did we get here? We got here because we had a lot of reasonably likely surrogates. We got here because sponsors said, look, I don't quite know if my therapy is going to totally shut off the proteinuria, or I know it won't, but I still think it's doing a good thing. So we got here because, we could use this pathway. It made sense. It existed. And we also got here, I think, because we did a long time of not, of this being an area that sponsors felt it wasn't really viable to conduct trials in, and so they invested in other areas. So we got here recognizing all the imperfections of the approach, and what we've tried to do is really think prospectively about all the issues, and then do our best in the design aspects to address them. But how this will all turn out, who knows? It really needs to be a partnership with the community. If you have patients or as an investigator, you don't think it's ethical to do this, then please do not enroll anyone in this trial, right? And as a patient, please do not enroll in this trial because it will certainly jeopardize the ability, a huge public health issue, which is whether the therapy is actually benefiting patients. In terms of some of the things we do, I mean, in general, we want the trials to be done within a year or two following approval. And we also bank on the fact that these are international trials, and so they may not become accessible in all regions. We bank on the fact that it takes us some time to review the results of the interim analysis. We also bank on the fact that payers may not be willing to pay for all of these patients getting their therapy, right the day it's approved. So it's a huge issue. In terms of the ethical issue, I would argue that, again, this is reasonably likely, right? Why are we doing these trials? Because we don't know whether treating, causing a 30% reduction in proteinuria in a given glomerular disease is going to translate to the benefit. So I would argue it is ethical. But again, if you think it's just obvious that proteinuria is going to translate to the benefit regardless of the magnitude of reduction, then would again say, please don't enroll your patients in these trials, and make sure your patients who wouldn't want to stay in the trial, make sure they don't enter. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, that's great.
Yeah, and I'll add.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so we're not just doing it in IgA nephropathy, we're also doing it in FSGS too, right, Brad? So it's a similar model. And so we're going to have the same issue there. And a couple of things that we're building in with that is that, you ask the patients, you obviously have to consent them. But then after those 2 years, they all get offered open label treatment, right? If they stay in the study, and so then they get that promise of getting treatment at the end. So then they'll get long-term until in their country, in their region, that therapy gets approved. And it's not just the US, it's lots of regions where they may not have access to therapy for many years. And I'll say there is some altruism in this, because we had to do this for tolvaptan therapy, where we had to try and execute a trial where there was tolvaptan approved in many countries, and we had to ask patients to get exposure to placebo when they could go out there and get tolvaptan therapy. And so we had to ask them, will you be willing to undergo a placebo-controlled trial when you can just get therapy? And so you just have to ask the patients, are you willing to do this, knowing that you have a 50-50 chance? And so there's a lot of upfront that has to go into the doctor-patient relationship, and asking them, are you willing to do this? And so it's education, and it's making sure the patients are willing to do that and sign up, and being willing to get a novel therapy where in these disease states there isn't one. And then the other thing, Aliza showed the IgA nephropathy data of, are you willing to stay in this trial for 1 year, 2 years, knowing that you're going to have placebo? And they did the same workshop. She presented the IgA nephropathy data, but they asked the same thing to FSGS patients, because I was at that too. And I pulled up the slides from the FSGS workshop, and most of the patients said 1 or 2 years. It was 38% for 1 year, was 38% for 2 years after in the post-marketing. So a lot of patients were willing to do it. And I'll say, so far with our data, patients are staying in the studies and not dropping out. And it's part of the design, right? It's part of, you have to consent them, and you have to talk to them. And I will say it's a whole lot of effort operationally to build in, to make sure that we track each and every patient and keep them in the study through all the way, because you've got to have that data at the end of the day. Because as Lisa knows, you can't have missing patients, or how are they going to be able to answer the question at the end of the day? So, I mean, there's so much that goes into the infrastructure of this. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but yeah, it's a team effort across the board.
And we always want to do retention and stuff. Before we go off this topic, because this is really an interesting topic, I want Deb to weigh in on this type of trial design in pediatric trials, or bringing kids into these trials. What she thinks, has she done this before, that sort of thing.
Sure. Thanks for asking. And indeed, there's a trial in the field today in FSGS who follows this trial design. And to be perfectly honest with you, we have to really step back and ask ourselves the question from an ethical perspective. We don't have drugs for these conditions. The ones we're using are largely off-label We don't necessarily know the dose. We're not great at understanding the toxicity, and we clearly don't know that down into pediatrics, right? And so when we think about novel drug development to both improve our efficacy and to improve our toxicity profile that we've been experiencing with standard diseases, the way we're getting these drugs into a market, right, is to be launching these kinds of trials with a pre-market, post-market type of an approach in this accelerated approval. And so this is actually a good option for adults and for children. And I would include those children, adolescents and children in these studies, and they're being done today very thoughtfully. But regardless of age in the design, you have to really remember that that design includes not only we need the endpoint to really understand the solid efficacy of the drug, but we also have included these caveats that deal with patient safety assessments and when it's time to stop being in the study, regardless of what treatment arm you're in, because you've had some disease progression or some indication that you should come out. And those key considerations or design components, those are invaluable, and we have to be certain that our sites don't lose track of those, just like our design developers don't lose track of those, just like our consent and our IRB programs all have to really keep a laser focus on those safety margins and design considerations. And in that way, right, well designed, these I think are good trial designs and a nice way to be able to move novel drugs into the market. If we don't do that, we're going to go back to the 1980s and we're going to say, gee, we wish we had some drugs, and we don't. Right, we've got to, this is our way to do better.
Brad, I just want to make a quick follow-up to Deb's comment, because I think she hit on another critical issue when we talk about placebo-controlled trials, is that I think we don't do a good job of explaining them that in making clear to patients that they are receiving standard of care and that they will receive rescue therapy if they're doing poorly. It's not this idea. I think sometimes people think when we say placebo trials that they're not getting standard of care, or that their disease could be on some, they could be doing very poorly and they'd have to just sit in a trial for 2 years. That's not at all how they're designed. At the same time, the fact that we can rescue patients in trials is also challenging, because how do you interpret the data after someone was rescued? How do you factor that into your analysis? So that's just another, again, challenge in this space that we have to get experience with and get smarter about.
Mm-hmm. And I think just to sum this up, and then we'll hit another pretty controversial point. What everyone's saying is really it's on us as clinical investigators to communicate well with our patients. And it's really important for us to remember that, all of the folks on the phone or on the Zoom, et cetera, because, a lot of us are never trained in the clinical science domain. Although I think with organizations like NephCure and a lot of the ones you listed, KHI, we're getting much more interest in developing a infrastructure of clinical trials within the nephrology community, as opposed to only sort of rodent experiments, which is what I did when I grew up. So let me ask another. This is a big
and Brad, I'm actually I apologize, I'm gonna cut you off because I see Kristen in the corner there, and she does an amazing job. I don't know if you've ever watched her sessions, but she has done an amazing job of articulating to patients the accelerated approval concept, and also keeping them the concept that you got to stay in the trial. Kristen, can you maybe speak and share some of what you've done? Because I think it would be critical that the group understand how much the groups like NephCure are doing to really make sure that patients understand this issue or are informed about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I feel like, part of NephCure's main mission, right, is to accelerate research, but also to support and educate the patient community. And so I combine the two. So, as a nurse, I am a patient educator, and I have different platforms that I use to really drive in the focus of clinical trials. And really, I have intentionally and purposefully gone through and broken down some of these concepts. What is efficacy? What is tolerability? What is what does it really mean to be in a clinical trial, and really honing in on that specific part about how safety is the key to everything, right? So I have talked about, the importance of maintaining and retention within clinical trials, but also the point of communicating, communicating their questions, not only to the site coordinator, but to the PI, whichever one they have more access to. I think the more communication that they can give, obviously the more important that is. But really breaking these things down, because I think the more knowledge that they have, right, the more perceived knowledge that they have, the more ability and confidence that they will have in the process in and of itself.
Great, thank you, Kristen. And okay, let me move to a big elephant in the room that's on its way to the GN space. And this is actually a question raised by Dick Glassick and several people on the Zoom, which is, what are we going to do with the SGLT2 inhibitors now that they're approved and people are starting to explore them in chronic kidney disease of any etiology? And how will we handle these in terms of trials that are already up and running that have not incorporated this? And let me open it up to anyone who wants to be risky and take a stab at this.
Well,
No?
I'm just gonna. Well,
Okay,
I'm just
do
gonna note. Well, no. Let me just. And I also just want to share with our colleagues outside of Europe. On Friday we approved in the U.S. SGLT2 inhibitor, one of the agents to treat chronic kidney disease of at least most etiologies. And as some of you may know, the trial that was conducted to support this approval included a number of patients with, sort of chronic glomerular diseases. So, IgA nephropathy, there was a pretty good representation there. So I think this is always the issue that we face, which is as we're doing trials, and Jula can speak to this, new therapies become available. And what do you do with that in your trial? How do you still make it so at the end of the day, the results are still, when the drug, if it gets approved, the community knows how to use it with other therapies, et cetera. It's a challenging issue, but it's also a wonderful challenge to have because it means you're having successes in a space. So maybe Jula, do you want to say anything more?
Oh, this is a hot topic of conversation with everyone right now. What do we do? Because we're planning new trials. What do we do with those that are ongoing? Should we allow them? If so, do we stratify by it? You only have a couple stratification factors or variables based on your sample size because these are all small trials. You've got 380 maybe or so patients, so you can only have so many stratification variables. And it's going to impact your EGFR, so you've got to include it. And for those that are ongoing, what do you do? Because most of them were prohibited con meds in the beginning. And so what are you going to do for those patients that get started on it? So it absolutely is a key factor that we're discussing with pretty much every company right now. I don't have an answer, but it is definitely a hot topic. For those that are in design, those that are in startup, and those that are planning and up and coming, and pretty much all the glomerular diseases. I'm excited because it's great. All the trials are global, right? So they're in 20 plus countries. And so the uptake is probably going to take a while. I mean, even when I look at the DKD patients, less than 10% of them right now are on it. But it's still important. And I would hope that our glomerular disease people will use it more, but I'm a realist knowing that it's not likely to get taken up as high as we would like. But I don't know, we're going to have to come up with a solution. I don't know, I'm curious what other people are thinking on the phone and what other people have considered, but yes, we're all discussing it readily right now.
So Deb has the answer, I know it.
Yeah, so we can talk about the pediatric version of this, but it's a key issue here, and I think the uptake, my expectations, the uptake will be faster, actually, in some of these rare glomerular diseases than it was in diabetes. And to be perfectly honest with you, because when you look at diabetes, you can sort of look down therapies and you can go, have access to it, those sorts of things. And there's some new things, and so there's been a lot of enthusiasm in glomerular disease spaces. While there's enthusiasm for the clinical trials that are underway and up and coming, when you look at what's the sort of the common armamentarium of therapies, it's it hasn't been sort of marching forward promptly So my expectation is there'll be a fair amount of eagerness for folks who might otherwise be interested in being in trials and connected into those spaces to step into therapy with SGLT2 inhibitors. So it'll be interesting to see sort of that trajectory. And I think at the present time, I think that for trial design perspective, I think this is going to be important. It's hard to spin your stratification factor on something that you don't know how it's going to affect natural history across every single trial known to mankind. But it is a degree of uncertainty that I think is going to be a key issue for people, and it may find its way in pretty quickly. And in the meantime, for the trials that are underway, my expectation is that we'll see a fair number of statistical analysis plans that are being modified. And we may or may not see some impact on trial acceptability for trials that have an SGLT2 inhibitor exclusion criteria after about a year after approval. I suspect it's going to have a negative impact if it isn't accommodated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think this also might speak a little bit to what Aliza was saying earlier, which is we have to increase the diversity of our trials, and diversity also includes people who are older and people who already have advanced chronic kidney disease, and that may be something that we'll think about as we enroll such patients in trials. So let me switch over to a PRO question that was posted from the audience, and I'm going to direct this to Deb to start with, which is, are we going to have to settle for using what adults think, adult PROs in kids, or are you developing your own PROs for?
Well,
and is that age stratified?
Yeah. Nice question to ask. So no, we're actually, there are PROs that are in development or in validation phases that go down to what we consider to be a reasonable age group for self-report, which is age 8 and up. In addition, and that is age 8 and up, so it doesn't break at a certain age groups, which can be really incredibly important. But those are not, not developed across every single, subdisease. And so we're thinking hard about how to do this. In addition, there are ways to develop what's considered an OBSRO, an observer reported outcome from a non-clinician. So think about a parent or a caregiver, so that measures can also be developed and used in an OBSRO that complements the patient reported outcome measure, the PRO. And in combination, then you've got lifespan related measures. We were just notified, and Aliza knows this, we were just notified the FDA's interest in supporting a new collaborative work to develop fluid overload outcome measures, PROs and OBSROs, so across the lifespan for glomerular diseases for nephrotic syndrome focus. And so that is nice from our perspective, because it'll be a really nice collaboration between PRO and OBSRO experts, members of industry and expert panels, as well as academicians, and the FDA, which are key partners for this type of grant program. So we don't have to wait forever. There is a clear intention not only to accept these as endpoints, but to invest in helping to make sure that there are strong ones available, which what I consider to be, the ones that are potentially acceptable, right? Just like any other clinical endpoint, or validated and ready to use off the shelf. And both are available, and PROs are being used now in many clinical trials, phase 2 and beyond. But as you know, some of the historic ones give us difficulties because they're a little too generic, and because they sort of break your power if you have to pick a different set of questions for every different age group. It makes it difficult. So we're trying to solve that problem.
Jula, any thoughts from the sponsor side?
Well, it's definitely an important one, and also having the data available that it is specific to glomerular disease is really important, because as Deb mentioned, they're relatively generic, and then also to be able to differentiate the therapies, and then also to be able to inform for the patients. I mean, I'm a dreamer, and to be able to think that we're going to have enough therapies out there that patients will be able to have the option to pick based on their disease and their symptomatology. And I think having the outcomes and the assessments to be able to inform them in the future Right now, we're more at the point of, okay, let me look at what the side effect profile might be for a clinical trial to be able to pick, but I'm hopeful that in the future, we'll be able to look at what the symptoms are and be able to pick a therapy based on that. But we need the instruments, we need them to be tested, to be able to be validated, and then for that information to be available for patients in the future to be able to make those decisions. But I think it's great that we're going to have a tool that's available, and then to be able to disseminate it in the information in the future.
So, Aliza, how do you think this is going to play out in the regulatory space? Is this going to eventually become something that the FDA wants to see as part of an endpoint?
Well, I think we already want to see it. I mean, to be honest, looking to the NephCure, I can't remember, Christine, I've been at the agency, I think maybe 14 years, and early on in that career, we at NephCure Foundation put together a workshop. So it's a small group of people, but experts in instrument development. And I think, Deb, you were there as well, and started saying, what do we need to do to get this instrument for nephrotic syndrome? It's taken us a long time, but I think hopefully we're going to get there. And I think what's accelerating this now is just also the interest on the part of industry in this space, hearing from patients that their symptoms matter a lot. I mean, I still remember, I think, from that NephCure meeting, if not another one, a mother sharing essentially for her adolescent, I think, in the setting of some of his nephrotic syndrome sort of spells, she had to have clothes that were like 3 sizes up. He essentially would go into one size and then shrink back to the other after the episode was treated. So, it's clear that this is where we need to be focusing on in terms of, the benefits. And the more recent discovery for us was, wow, that this fatigue was such a huge issue, which is, I think, if you look at some of the IgA nephropathy trials, we're seeing people assessing fatigue. So I think that this is where we want, we need good instruments in part because if they're not good, you're not going to be able to detect the treatment effect. That's really the big issue here. They're sort of generic, but I think it's where we need to go. I'm tremendously, appreciative of all those. Deb's been on this for a long time. NephCure has been in this for a long time. I'm excited. I'm excited about the opportunity that we have with Deb and her group, and hopefully we'll continue to see people working in this area. Jula, hopefully you'll convince all of industry to work together and, share their learnings. We have had some industry share what they're learning, but doing even more of it would be even better.
So, Dia, we're right on time. Do you want to go with another question, or how should we do this?
If all the panelists are willing, we can continue with another question, if that's all right.
I have one hard one left.
All right, let's end with that.
Well, hard, or something to make us think. And I know all of us, and many of the folks on the Zoom as well, have been thinking about, we have very traditional trials that we've been doing for a long time, and this came up in one of the chat questions, but what is the role of pragmatic trials in GN? And let me expand that a little bit more. How can we think of new ways to approach these rare diseases, and what would be acceptable to the FDA in terms of unique opportunities? So I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna start with Jula, in terms of unique trial designs, and then Deb. And Deb and I were just on something looking at complement trial designs, so I know she has a lot of thoughts on that. And then maybe we can wrap up with the FDA perspective on these new trial designs that you hear right now. So Jula, what do you think?
So less on pragmatic, but I'll go back to what Aliza had commented on trying to make things as simple as possible. And I can tell you we're running a hybrid virtual trial where the patients essentially just come in to the clinic once a year and all the rest of their visits are at home. And that's an IgA nephropathy. So really trying to streamline, and everything else is done at their home. And we've done this before, actually, even pre-COVID, where patients we just send them a home health nurse visit. and the visits can be optional. And so trying to make things as simple as possible for patients, and particularly when you've got pediatrics or adolescents where things are simple, you still have to get the data, right? And essentially, these are lab-based endpoints. And so as long as you have a phone visit and you're finding out how they're tolerating the therapy, but everything else is lab-based, you can make these trials as simple as possible, particularly as you're moving into phase 3. And that's what we're trying to do. And I would say COVID has pushed a lot of countries that otherwise didn't used to allow such a thing to occur. Like France, for example, didn't used to allow us to do these sorts of things, have allowed us now to do it. And we're doing this in 40 plus countries where we're doing remote virtual visits. But you have to make sure the data is there and quality. Some of those other interesting things that people have thrown out of N of 1, where each patient gets exposed to one therapy and crossover. I think that's really interesting. Haven't really gone through that design before. I'm curious what others think about that. But we are trying to make things being done as quick as possible, the adaptive trial design, where you don't just wait for the information. We're looking at that right now for an FSGS therapy. We're doing a lot of different things to try and streamline phase 2 to phase 3. So that's about what I'll comment. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
Okay, so I'll just say, I'll ask Deb to come on, but just as she's coming on, I think COVID has taught all of us that we can simplify the visits, all the things that Aliza said at the end of her talk, we can do, as long as the sponsors are willing to do it, which are remote visits, simplifying visits using collections from the doorway of 24-hour jugs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we're going to get anything out of this pandemic, it's how to operate more smoothly in the future. So I think that's useful. I would rather not have learned it that way, but anyway, it's useful. So Deb, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so so the interesting sort of question about pragmatic trial design is really an interesting one, right? So we all like to think about pragmatic trial design, but the question is, and can it be used for regulatory approval? And it's interesting because I exchanged a very brief email with Aliza a week or so ago, talking about the use of real world data also, as we're thinking about sort of the generating evidence to support therapy use. And that becomes an incredibly important event because we want to actually do the research we need to do. But we want to not to do a bunch of studies because it's the way we used to do it. And so we think we should do it that way. And considering a pragmatic trial or real world data can be incredibly helpful for us to think about where our evidence really lie. But also, I think oftentimes to help us to hammer in a very tight question, right? What are our real questions? What is our real natural history? What do we have as best evidence to make sure that we're really asking the right questions and getting to the right answer? And that becomes incredible. It actually applies to the consideration for children. And I'm going to sort of bring this home when we think about using extrapolation of data and results from trials from other populations. Think about adults to children, think about other diseases to glomerular disease. What information is already in hand that we might extrapolate? And what are the key questions that are left on the table that we really have to address in our own very specific rare disease type of clinical trials? And where can we really borrow and point to other really sound evidence that's come from other directions? And that becomes an important consideration as we think about adaptive trial designs. For example, building in dose finding in pediatric trials can be a nice way to think about extrapolating data, but also sort of using information that we can and generate information, as Julia said, as part of what we're learning within a trial. And having planned interim analyses and adaptation that have been pre-planned in order to step to the next step. So we don't have to end the trial and redesign and begin again.
Great. All right, Aliza, you have the last word.
Actually, I'm going to give the last one to Kristen because I think she interacts most closely with the patients. But I'll just offer that, I think that there were, as others have noted, with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really pushed us to really consider more of these decentralized trials to really accelerate the approach. And by that, I mean, again, the patient not showing up at the clinic, but really, things coming to the patient, using telehealth, using the medical record, using other things. It's where we need to go. We have a lot to learn. But Kristen, can you maybe close us out since you work most closely perhaps with the patients? certainly more closely than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Over the last, year, COVID obviously changed a lot of what NephCure and how we interacted with patients. And honestly, I think that we were able to reach a lot more patients going to a more, virtual format. I think patients were more comfortable with that. So what we did over the course of 2020 was we held many focus groups and listening sessions for industry sponsors where we had patients panels and we would ask them specific questions. And it would anything from, patient-physician relationships to clinical trial participation, what motivates you, what demotivates you, what influences you, what is most important to you as far as outcomes, especially whenever you're talking about like quality of life versus kidney function and EGFR and that sort of thing. So, it was also really interesting because we asked those pertinent questions around telehealth and we asked those pertinent questions around, nurse visits during clinical trials. And the resounding response was the option of it. A lot of patients love their nephrologist. I feel like nephrology, of all of the specialties, I feel like the patients love their doctors the most. I mean, from my experience as a nurse. And so, one of the things that was really poignant was that, I would say probably 50% was like, yes, the option of having someone come to my home, to collect the clinical, data, collect my urine. So literally one patient said, so I don't have to schlep it into a subway in New York City. She said that is huge. Whereas another patient said, you know what, our appointments with our doctors are so vitally important, that we appreciate the physical, the face-to-face communication and contact. So I think going forward, making sure that the option, the flexibility of clinical trials is really the key point in looking at these pragmatic and creative clinical trial designs.
Wow, that's a great point. And we all like options, and we should have it in clinical trial work as well. So I think from a personal point of view and a professional point of view, this has been wonderful. The panel, you all were great. Everyone was engaged. The audience was engaged with good questions. I just want to say thank you for letting me participate in this, and I'll turn it over to Dia.
Yes, thank you all. Thanks, Brad, for moderating, and to each of you, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Gipson, Dr. Inrig, and Kristen for sharing everything, and everyone who joined always makes this a lively discussion. Such an important topic, and we'll hopefully do this again soon because there's probably a lot more we can continue to talk about. So thank you guys all. Everyone have a great rest of their day or evening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.